Alright, hi, my name is Sarah and I'm the designer behind Neckline's pattern. And today I'm going to be doing a sew along for the COVE blouse. I'm doing the View 3, which is the long sleeve with the neckline flounce. Actually, I'm wearing the symbol now. I also have another sew along, which is of the View 1, the sleeveless, the baseline version of the pattern. So if that's what you're looking for, go see that video. Alright, so just a few things I want to mention before we start. The neckline and waistline flounce, they're optional. So you can add them, you can skip them, you can mix and match them. Also, the COVE blouse is designed to work with the COVE dress. So if you have both pattern, you can also mix and match them. There's only two exceptions, but those are mentioned on the website and in the instruction of the COVE blouse. So should be pretty clear. Then let's talk about fabric. So for this pattern, what works well is lightweight to mid-weight woven, and then depending on what kind of fabric you pick is going to affect like the final look of it and also the final fit. So fabric like linen or cotton is going to give more structure to the pattern. Fabric like rayon, for example, this is a crinkle rayon, will give more fluidity and will just be more drapey overall. So yeah, that's just something you'll want to keep in mind depending on what vibe or what look you're going for. Also, the last thing I want to mention before we start is that I personally use, for my personal patterns, I use a 1 centimeter seam allowance. The COVE blouse pattern or any of my patterns really always use a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So if my seam allowance while I'm sewing look a bit thin to you, that's why. It doesn't change anything in the pattern. It's just my personal preference and what I learned to sew with. So that's the only thing that I'll say. And yeah, that's pretty much it, I think. Alright, so let's jump into the tutorial. Okay, bye. Alright, so the first thing we want to do here is to stay stitch your neckline, and we do this mainly to prevent the neckline from stretching. I would say for this pattern in particular, the front pieces are the most important because they're mainly cut on the bias. Then, right sides together, you want to sew down the center front seam, press that seam open, and then you'll repeat the same step for the lining. Once that's done, let's sew the shoulder seams together, press that seam open, and repeat for the lining. Alright, so now we'll jump into the neckline flounce and we'll start by hemming it. If you have a rolling foot or if you want to use a different technique, that's all good. Just be aware that the hem here is 1.2 centimeter. Alright, so we'll start by stay stitching all around the hem, 6 mm from the edge, and here you want to use your longest stitch as we'll take that seam out later. This seam will serve as a folding guide because it helps stop the fabric from stretching while you're going to be folding it. Now that we have our folding guide, fold and press the edge to the wrong side twice. Okay, now that the hem is folded twice, the next step is to remove the basting stitch. You can totally leave the basting stitch in, but I find that it creates a bit of a rigidity in the flounce, and I want my flounces to be as bouncy as possible, so I always take them out. Now, taking it out will undo the folded edges slightly, so you might feel like doing all this prep was pointless, but I promise you that your folded edges will very easily be pressed back into place once your basting stitch is removed. Okay, so now that the prep is done and the basting stitch is removed, it's time to stitch that hem down. Next, we'll finish the center front of the flounce by turning it 6 mm to the wrong side twice and stitching it down. Next, let's make gathering stitches at the top of the flounce. I always use elastic thread in my bobbin to do the gathering stitches, so that's still what I'll do, but you can use whatever technique you want. And in the instructions, I also have a separate annex on my fave method, so you can check that out. Once your flounce is all prepped and gathered, we'll pin it down to the neckline. The flounce has notches that match the shoulder seam and a double notch for the center back, so start by pinning those down and then pin the finished ends of the flounce at the center front. Once everything is pinned in place, you'll want to base stitch the flounce to the bodice using a 1.2 cm seam allowance. So just a few inside the 1.5 seam allowance that we'll be using to sew the lining to the main fabric later. Once the flounce is basted on, remove the gathering stitches. Next, we'll put the main fabric right sides together with the lining and stitch all around the neckline. Then you'll want to clip in the seam. When you're clipping a seam, you want to get as close to the seam line as possible. Otherwise, you'll see that when you turn everything right sides out, there might be some weird pulling around the curved areas. For this project, the back neckline around the shoulders is where you want to make sure you clip in your seam very well because it's the most curved area of that neckline. Next, you'll want to understitch the lining around the neckline. So basically when you're understitching, you send the lining and the seam allowances out to one side and sew through all the layers while staying pretty close to the seam line, about 2 mm. What understitching does is that it prevents the lining from peeking through or rolling out when you're wearing the top. Next, we'll turn everything right side out and press around the neckline very well. Alright, so this next step is simple. It's just a bit confusing to find the right sides to sew together sometimes. So what we want to do here is stitch the side seams together, but you want to make sure you sew your main fabrics together and your linings together. So in reality, you'll have 4 separate side seams, 1 on each side for your main fabric and 1 on each side for your lining. Once you're done, make sure to press them open. Alright, now the next step is to prep the gathering stitches that are under the bust. Once again, I'll be using elastic thread, but you can use your preferred method. So we want to do the gathering stitches in between the two notches that are under the bust. And for this step, you also want to sew through the lining so your main fabric and linings are now sewn together. When that's done, you'll want to go around the rest of the bottom and base stitch the main and lining together. At the center front, I like to make my basting stitch the same seam allowance as when I'll be sewing the bottom. I go over it a couple times to reinforce that seam, and then I clip into the seam right down the middle. This is going to allow movement in the seam, and it's really going to help us when we sew it to the lower part later on. Alright, so now we're done with the bodice part and we'll move to the lower part. The first thing to do here is to stitch the side seams together, right sides together. And please note that here the lower part is not lined, so once the seam is done, you need to finish it with your preferred method. And then when your seams are finished, press them towards the back. Alright, next I'm moving on to the hem. You can wait till the end to do this step, but I like to do it now, so that's just what we'll do. Basically, it's very straightforward. We'll just fold and press the hem twice to the wrong side, about 6 mm. At least it should be 6 mm, but I always eyeball mine, so it's more like 8 mm, but honestly, I just roll with it. Anyway, once the hem is prepped, we'll sew it down about 2 mm from the folded edge to finish. Alright, so now the lower part is done and it's time to sew it to the bodice. The first thing to do is to pull on the underbust gathering threads we made previously until they match the notches on the lower part. In my case though, since I used elastic thread, I don't need to do that, and I'll simply stretch the underbust part when I'm sewing it so it matches the notches on the lower part. To stitch the bodice and lower parts together, I like to insert the lower part into the bodice, right sides together, and pin it in place at the side seams, the double notch at the center back, the underbust notches, and at the center front. Once everything is pinned, we can finally sew the bodice to the lower part. When you get to the center front, you'll see that the lower part comes up in a triangle, and the bodice, which we clipped down the center, remember, has this inverted triangle kind of shape. These two shapes are opposite, so they're not gonna lie perfectly on top of each other. So what you'll do instead here is sew over your basting stitch right up to where we clipped in that seam. Leave your needle in, pivot your project, and then keep sewing. This should give you a neat point at the center front and avoid any wrinkle. Once that seam is done, finish it and we'll move on to the sleeve. Alright, so before we start on the sleeve, I just want to make a disclaimer that the steps for this sleeve might look a bit backwards or counterintuitive, but I swear we're going somewhere and the end result is it's worth it. That being said, we'll start by prepping the sleeve ties, so folding the short ends 1 centimeter to the wrong side and pressing very well. Next, fold the ties in half lengthwise and press. We only really want to create a crease here. Then open up the ties and press the edges inwards so they meet in the middle where the center crease is. Once that's done, refold everything and press well so that all your raw edges are encased. To finish, sew 2 mm all around the folded edges, even the short ones. Give your ties a final press and set aside for now. Next, we'll grab the sleeve channel and make the openings for the ties. I recommend putting down a piece of interfacing here to reinforce the fabric, especially if you're using something more lightweight. Alright, so my machine only does a straight stitch and I didn't feel like threading my brother machine. So instead what I do is I set my stitch length super short and I go around the openings a few times. It's not the cleanest result, but I feel like once the ties are in, it's really not the main focus. Alright, so once that's done, fold the channel wrong sides together and press. Unfold the channel, put the short ends right sides together and sew to create a circular piece. Once the sides are sewn together, press that seam open, then turn everything right side out, fold it back in half, press well, and then set that piece aside. Now, taking the upper part of the long sleeve, we'll fold it so the right sides are together and stitch down the underarm seam. Finish that seam and press it towards the back of the sleeve. Next, we'll grab the lower part of the long sleeve and prep the hem by folding it 6 mm twice to the wrong side. Now, just like we did for the sleeve channel, we'll unfold the hem, put the short ends right sides together and sew down that side to create a circular piece. Finish that seam and press it towards the back of the sleeve. Then refold the hem, press it back in place and stitch it down to finish. Alright, so now you have 3 separate pieces that create your sleeve and we'll put them all together. Start by inserting the lower sleeve into the upper sleeve, wrong sides together, and pin at the underarm seam and at the middle notch. Then you'll take the channel and put it on top of the sleeve and make sure the side with the openings is facing the right side of the sleeve. Listen, I know this part can be a bit confusing, so just make sure you take your time to do it. Alright, so once all your layers are pinned in place, it's time to sew them all together. Once that seam is done, all your seam allowances are going to be on the right side of your sleeve, and that's normal. Now, because there's quite a lot of layers here, grade your seam allowances and then press the sleeve channel down so it covers the graded seam allowances. Stitch the free edge of the sleeve channel to the sleeve and that will create said channel for the tie to go through. Once your channel is created, insert the tie in the channel using a safety pin. Then, before sewing the sleeves on, I like to run a long stitch between the sleeve notches to help reduce the ease of the sleeve gap. So I push the fabric slightly while I'm sewing, and this helps the feed dogs under the machine resorb that excess. I have an annex at the end of the instructions explaining it clearly if you're curious and need more info, so yeah, just check that out. But yeah, anyway, once that's done, we'll insert our sleeve into the bodice, right sides together, and sew. Once that's done, we finish the seams, press it towards the bodice, and yeah, we're basically done. And this is the final look. See? This is like funky. This is funky fresh. It's so fun. I wasn't sure like the patchwork was gonna be too much, but I feel like it really works well. It's really giving that boho vibe. Okay, I like. So yeah, thanks for coming along. And I guess I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.